Hello, this is a short presentation by Select Plant Hire on sustainable electrical power for sites. So there's two main types of demand we see on sites. One is where it's constant, and those are things like lighting, heating, 110 volt power and cooking. Yes, there will be changes and variations throughout the day and throughout the seasons, but it's a relatively consistent draw and might increase slowly throughout the day and so on, but it doesn't have sudden surges in demand. The alternative we see is dynamic. Now these are main culprits of things like tower cranes, concrete pumps, welding sets, water pumps, and to a lesser degree hoists. And this is where they have a sudden surge in demand when an electrical motor starts. And that means that the site supply tends to have to be very large in order to cope for that. And therefore it's a very different requirement. So obviously the perfect solution will always be to use mains power where possible, or almost always. Alternatively, you're onto generators. So the tier 3 generators, it's an old standard, it's been around for a long time. It's a relatively simple engine, it doesn't have much filtration on it, but therefore it has relatively high emissions. But because it's simple, it's reliable, readily available. Now we're starting to see more and more stage 5 generators come onto the market. Now they are low emissions. They use AdBlue, which is a liquid that's injected into the exhaust to burn off the oxides of nitrogen, or NOx. Stage 5 engines can be quite fussy and they do like to be loaded up properly. If they're not loaded up properly, it can cause them to regenerate, and actually there's occasions where it might actually develop an error code and actually cut off power. So you have to manage them properly and make sure they're correctly loaded. Also, the AdBlue has to be managed on site. Again, if you fail to fill it up, they will stop running. What we are seeing is some companies are now pairing them with batteries in order to keep them loaded up, and we'll discuss that on the next slide. So the hybrid batteries have been designed to be paired with a stage 5 generator, and what it does is it constantly draws a demand off the generator in order to keep it in that sweet spot. So it pulls around 75% load until the battery is fully charged, and then it turns the generator off. So the bonus there is you're saving fuel, you're keeping your generator working in its sweet spot, but also you've then got power that can run things out of hours like aircraft warning lights on cranes or site security and so on. The other unit that we use quite often is the Punch Flybrid. Now what this is an electric motor that spins up and it's powered by the generator. It stores energy by way of a flywheel. When there's a sudden demand from something like a crane, the flywheel discharges that energy to deliver that surge in power that's been required, and that allows the generator time to pick up, which means we can make it a much smaller generator because it no longer has to deliver such a large power output. And that will reduce the fuel consumption because the engine's much smaller in a smaller generator, and therefore your emissions are much lower too. Next we have two different types of battery. The first is a standard site battery, which is for constant demand applications. We're finding the sizes that are readily available tend to be quite small, so sometimes we're having to split circuits up. We're beginning to see larger batteries come onto the market, which makes this sort of setup much easier. But there is a potential gain there, not only from powering things from quite a small power supply, but you might even be able to use an out-of-hours tariff, which Laing O'Rourke currently don't have, but an off-peak tariff might actually save quite a lot of money for charging the battery itself. You've also got the same for the high output batteries. Now these are designed for the dynamic loads like the tower cranes. They're a relatively small battery but with a very large output, so they're delivering those sudden spikes and demands in power. And what we're finding is they can actually be charged with quite a small power supply, sometimes as low as sort of 32 amps. So it's actually saving quite a lot of money on cabling across the site, but also again it could use an out-of-hour tariff, potentially saving quite a lot of money as well as the cabling and so on. Now here we have a decision tree to help you decide the best option for your site. Obviously the best solution by far is to have sufficient mains power. Now it's obviously important to engage with the client early to try and achieve this, but this has to be the number one aim. Next is if you have no mains power available. First thing to do is to obtain a temporary builder supply if possible. In the meantime, this is the route you should head down. So you can either go for a stage 5 generator with the hybrid battery. You could consider going for a stage 3 generator, again fueled by HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil. That will reduce the emissions at the point of use slightly, but ultimately you're still burning fuel. The next is to add a flybrid to that generator. Now that can really help with a dynamic load, and that will ensure that the generator's size is reduced and therefore the emissions and so on. After that, you can start looking at the stage 5 generator with a hybrid and a flybrid. So the hybrid enables the generator size to be reduced and then turned off. The flybrid actually allows it to be reduced yet further, which potentially means that you've got a very small generator running for a limited period of time. So the savings on fuel and noise and emissions are quite dramatic. Now, if you do have some mains power available, but it's not normally enough to run the site, you've got a couple of options. One, if you've got a constant demand, is to use the battery, which we've just talked about. The second is to actually use the specialist battery for a dynamic load, such as a tower crane. And there's quite a lot of savings to be had there. And the last is to actually use the flybrid on mains. Now, potentially that could be a cheap way of reducing the size of the power supply required by site. I hope you found this useful. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to email sustainability@selectplantire.com. Thank you for watching.